I remember the last time I saw my sister. She came to my house. She was very happy that day that I saw him. He bought her a ring. They were going to get married. I remember when they got ready to leave, and we just waved and waved until we couldn't see her. I think that will forever be in my mind. The next morning, the phone rang, and it was my mom. She said, "They found Carla." I said, "What do you mean they found her?" And she said, "They shot her." I said, "They shot her? Who shot? What do you mean? What are you talking about?"
It looked like a roadside robbery.
He basically said it all happened so fast he couldn't give them many details.
I can't remember all of the policemen, and the community reacted kind of like we did. Everybody was very angry. Sometimes people can mislead you, misguide you. Sometimes you can be sleeping with a snake and don't even know it.
Surrounded by rich Delta farmland, the historic port town of Helena, Arkansas is a quaint and tight-knit community.
Helena, Arkansas, it has a population of 8,900, so it's a small area. It's a nice area. We're a Mississippi River town south of Memphis.
If you didn't consider Helena the heartbeat of the blues, it certainly was a major artery. A lot of people go there for the history of it. There are great museums there, and the King Biscuit Blues Festival is still there, and it's an interesting town.
Late in the evening on June 23, 2001, emergency dispatchers from the Phillips County Sheriff's Office receive a distraught phone call from local resident, 46-year-old Elbert Holder.
Elbert Holder called 911 saying that he had been robbed in the south part of Phillips County, Arkansas, on a highway in the middle of nowhere. He said they shot him and then they shot his girlfriend.
He was frantic and pleading for help. It was very clear that his fiancée was much more badly injured than he was.
Paramedics and law enforcement are immediately dispatched to the scene. The medics are first to arrive.
Elbert actually flagged them down, and they could tell that he was bleeding from one arm, but he quickly let them know that his fiancée, Carla Knowlton, was in the front passenger seat, and she was much worse off than he was and in desperate need of medical attention.
The first thing they did was check Carla's vitals and quickly realized that she was deceased at the scene.
He was very upset, very distraught, and you'd expect that of any man who just had his fiancée shot to death.
Elbert was beside himself. He could not understand who would want to do something like this.
Growing up in Helena, Arkansas, Carla Knowlton was the eldest of 6 siblings.
Carla, she was kind of like a mother hen to the rest of us. When my mom and dad would go to work and stuff, of course, she would be in charge.
A big sister was like mama. She was the enforcer. I mean, and she was a disciplinarian. She wasn't soft. If she had to jack you up, she would jack you up.
She was a happy, playful, loving kid. In school, she was a good student. She made good grades, made the honor roll. She was the president of her senior class.
All the teachers were like, Carla's gonna do this, Carla's gonna do that. I mean, so, yeah, she was an excellent student.
After graduating high school in 1980, Carla set her sights on college, but an unexpected pregnancy put those plans on pause.
Carla, when she got pregnant, it was a shocker for all of us. It was like, what's gonna happen now? So she didn't go off to college.
Later that year, Carla gave birth to her daughter, Kanika.
We were real close. We was not really a mother-daughter. She was just like my sister, my friend, versus my mom.
Kanika's father went into the Marines, so he was gone. I mean, he financially supported and took care of things, but he wasn't there.
As a young single mother, Carla was dedicated to providing for her daughter.
She went to nursing school, and she graduated class of 1983 from Phillips College of Helena.
She always wanted to help people. That was her calling. I don't think she would have wanted to do anything else.
She started working at Helena Hospital. And then after Helena Hospital, she started working different jobs, like at the nursing home and home health. I saw her like going to vacations and stuff like that, but she worked a lot. She'd come home, she cook, sleep.
She loved going to work. She loved helping people, especially the children. She would just sit there with them and talk to them.
She loved her profession, what she was doing. If you want a nurse, Carla would be the one that you want.
Once her career had taken off, Carla set her sights on finding lasting love.
She got married and she had 2 more kids. Her husband, which is my stepdad, they was married like 17 years.
Unfortunately, the marriage came to an end in 1998.
She's kind of private, and some things she just didn't share with the family. We just knew that they were getting a divorce.
She was sad about it because she was married a long time. She tried to make it work. It didn't work.
She didn't want to see it affect the kids. She kept her chin up and said, okay, let me move on and continue to do what I got to do, because it's about these kids.
Now she's kind of trying to do everything on her own as far as working. And I think she always longed for happiness.
She wanted to be happy. She wanted to help her husband and her family. She just wanted to be loved.
A year after her divorce, Carla finally met the man who would change her life forever.
My mom met Elbert Holder in 1999. She met him at the West Side on the fish market, and he moved in with us.
Elbert was 7 years older than Carla. He grew up in Helena as well, and he had a teenage son, and he was a single parent, much like Carla. Elbert was known to do quite a few odd jobs and a little bit of everything here and there. He was very focused on making money and was a bit of a hustler.
I think what she liked about him, or what drew her to him, was the fact that, you know, he would jump up in a minute and they would go shopping. She loved that. They would take a trip overnight.
He took her to Chicago on different trips. They say doing something fun, going to the casino, swimming. He was pretty much fun, you know. He kept us laughing. He showed her a lot of attention, a lot of affection. He did a lot of things for her that she'd never have.
He was a nice-looking guy. He was kind of fancy dresser, you know, and him and her could go out and go places, you know. He would go be dressed nice, and they could do things when she hadn't had anyone to really do these things with her. So she was excited.
She was a social butterfly. She liked to go places. Well, he came along and he did those things. So we started to see a different side of her, and she was happy. She was actually happy.
In May 2001, 2 years into their relationship, Elbert proposed.
My mom and Elbert had planned on doing a cruise the last weekend of July, and they was going to get married at the Bahamas. And she was so excited.
But just a month before their destination wedding, their future together is upended.
When they robbed Carla and him, they shot Carla and killed her, and they shot at him.
The sheriff's office contacted the Criminal Investigation Division with Arkansas State Police, so the Sheriff's Department and the State Police worked this case together.
Before Elbert is rushed to a local hospital, he gives investigators a brief statement.
Elbert's story was that he took Carla to work that day. Carla, she was a home health care nurse, and she had to go see a patient down near Elaine, which is about 30 miles south of Helena. That they drove down to Elaine, he waited for her to go in and see the patient, then they were driving back towards Helena. And there was car trouble. He pulled over to check the engine. He got out of the car, opened the hood, and 2 men pulled over. He thought they were pulling over to help, but they pulled a gun on him.
Elbert Holder reported that he had his wallet with $900 stolen from him.
For investigators, it looked like a roadside robbery with Carla being killed and Elbert being injured.
Elbert says that the men were armed with a shotgun. When they opened fire, he instinctively ducked out of the way.
He had a hat on, a cap on his head, and there was a bullet hole through the cap that he showed the police.
Elbert was extremely lucky that he wasn't killed too.
It was a very close call for Mr. Elbert.
After the shooting, the two guys got back in their car and then they just sped off. Elbert told investigators that it was two black men in a black Cadillac with Tennessee plates on it.
Police put out an all-points bulletin to the sheriff's departments to be on the lookout for a car meeting the description of a black Cadillac with Tennessee tags. We're 60 miles south of Memphis. There are probably 300 black Cadillacs in Memphis with Tennessee tags. So if that car gets back to Tennessee, it's over.
Coming up, crime scene details send investigators back to square one.
They would have left the scene in a hurry. So they looked for tire tracks, but there were no tire tracks that indicated that.
There were red flags all over the place.
And a tip comes in pointing to a long con and a twisted romance.
I think she got caught on to that bad boy deal. You know, oh, I got a bad boy.
Was this a case of if I can't have him, nobody can?
Hours after a roadside robbery claimed the life of Carla Knowlton and injured her fiancé, Elbert Holder, authorities in Arkansas are on the lookout for a black Cadillac with Tennessee plates.
The police start contacting law enforcement agencies over in Mississippi to see if anybody noticed a vehicle with Tennessee tags passing from Arkansas into Mississippi and then into Tennessee.
While investigators wait for an alert to come in, they consider the possibility that the perpetrators might have roots in their own community.
Helena, Arkansas, to me, is a nice area, but we are a declining area, declining in population. Since the 1970s, our factories moved and went overseas.
The population's declined over the years, but criminals hadn't gone anywhere. A lot of the homicides appear to be drug-related homicides, some gang-related retaliation type stuff. You do get some robberies.
We don't have descriptions of the shooters other than two black males. That could be anybody.
Arkansas State Police investigators begin processing the crime scene.
There were 3 shotgun shells found at the scene, so they were submitted for analysis.
You would assume that if somebody committed a robbery and shot 2 people and killing 1, that they would have left the scene in a hurry. So they looked for tire tracks that indicated that anybody had pulled off quickly. But there were no tire tracks that indicated that.
There wasn't a whole lot at the crime scene other than the shell casings that were identified.
There was an abandoned house not too far from the crime scene, and outside, they did find Elbert's empty wallet.
Elbert told them that there was a wallet stolen, so maybe they ditched it.
Without much to go on, investigators search for potential witnesses.
Although Highway 85 is very rural, there were also some residential homes not too far away.
The police canvassed the area to interview any witnesses that may have potentially saw or heard something.
There was a witness that said that she saw a car parked out there near the scene, but not a black Cadillac.
That person told them that they believed they saw a lighter-colored sedan.
And so the police set out to trace the whereabouts of that car. Obviously, they wanted to know where these people were.
Meanwhile, investigators learn that Elbert is in stable condition.
The wound on Mr. Holder's arm was enough to draw blood, but it was not a significant wound. It was like a grazed wound.
By the following morning, news of Carla's death reaches her family.
My grandma came and they told me, we're sorry, your mom, has been killed. And right now we don't know what happened. But at that point I just broke down. It was horrible. I was devastated. I couldn't eat, sleep, or anything.
They kept saying, she gone, you know, but I never accepted it.
I was just in like dismay, just shocked, like, what do you mean? What do you mean? I screamed and I hollered, and some neighbors had to come and comfort me. It was really bad.
After being discharged from the hospital, investigators visit Elbert at his home for a second interview.
His story was he had never seen this car. He didn't know who was in it. The people were wearing masks, and he basically said it all happened so fast he couldn't give them many details. Investigators thought his demeanor was very calm and different than what they would expect him to be acting like. They know the cues they're expecting to see from victims when they're recounting what happened to a loved one. And emotion, sobbing and crying is usually part of it.
Investigators left that meeting with Elbert, and this is when they started to realize that things just weren't adding up.
Investigators shift their focus to Carla's autopsy.
The medical examiner found that Carla was hit 3 times with a 12-gauge shotgun, twice to the head and once to the chest.
The evidence that was recovered from the actual autopsy itself were shotgun pellets, and those were submitted to the firearms section of the laboratory, along with clothing from the victim's body.
The 12-gauge shotgun is going to cause massive damage. I'm sure she died instantly. The crime lab can match shell casings based upon ejection scratches or patterns, and they determined that all 3 of those shell casings came from the same shotgun. If they find a weapon, they can match it.
When experts analyze the hat Elbert was wearing when the shooting occurred, the report raises several questions.
Elbert said he was able to dive out of the way, but his hat was grazed by the spray of the shotgun.
The hat was examined, and it appeared to be a bigger caliber weapon than just simple shotgun pellets that are penetrating through it. And that would have been based on the soot analysis surrounding the diameter of the hole itself.
They can determine by the residue on the hat how close of range the shot was. And they determined fairly quickly that the shot came from very close by. It didn't make sense that Elbert was shot in the hat, but the bullet missed his head.
There were red flags all over the place. His graze wound to his arm was pretty much superficial, so he was relatively unharmed. But yet Miss Knowlton was shot in the head and killed.
The fact that he was grazed in the arm, although he was the one outside who confronted the 2 men when they came to rob him, and why they walked around to the car and shot Carla with a shotgun. That didn't make a lot of sense. It just seemed like that was not a true story. Elbert became a suspect fairly quickly.
Less than a day after the roadside ambush that killed Carla Knowlton, investigators are becoming increasingly suspicious of her fiancé Elbert Holder's account of the shooting.
The loved one of the victim, the spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend, is always a suspect.
When a murder occurs, every good police officer will tell you this: everybody's a suspect. And then you start eliminating people that couldn't have possibly done it. So Holder was a suspect immediately.
When investigators pull Elbert's criminal record, they discover he's no stranger to the law.
I don't recall Mr. Holder having any violent acts in his history. He did have some insurance fraud claims that went back a few years.
Holder pretty much made a career on running scams and insurance scams. And I'm not sure what he did for a living, what his honest job was, so to speak. But my understanding is every so often he would run an insurance scam, and that's how he made money.
There was a lawyer down there in Louisiana. I remember talking to him on the phone. Came to find out that there was a case that was filed in Louisiana over some insurance fraud that he was alleged to have committed down there. He allegedly reported some property stolen that he still had. It was a big enough of an issue that the insurance company filed suit against him.
Elbert had also reportedly suffered an injury on a Mississippi riverboat job.
Elbert claimed that the boat he was working on was hit by a barge and that he was injured, his back or his spine, but to the point where he could hardly walk and he couldn't even work. And that's when he filed a workman's comp claim for about $140,000.
Investigators reach out to Carla's grieving family to see if they can provide any additional information on Elbert.
I knew that he was into this workman's comp scam. He was a street guy, and any way to make money in the streets, that's what he did. He was selling sex toys and videotapes out of his trunk and doing things that the average person wouldn't do. Nothing legit. And I'm like, what is Carla doing with him? Why is she with him?
He grew up poor. He started hustling and getting money through scamming and figuring out how to get money. That was the lifestyle he lived.
Carla went through a divorce, and so I think Elbert came in, saying nice things, buying her things, and I think she kind of like got caught on to that bad boy deal. You know, oh, I got a bad boy.
They were like oil and water, but she was so happy, and so we were like, you know what? Maybe it's not so bad after all.
Carla's family tells investigators that she accidentally tipped off Elbert's scamming activities to his lawyers.
He had used her phone and had called and talked with the lawyers, so they had this number they called back to the house one day and asked her, where was he? But she told him he was gone riding his motorcycle. They say, riding a motorcycle? He can ride a motorcycle?
Elbert was supposed to have been disabled, couldn't work because of his back.
Her family says a few months earlier, Elbert and Carla had driven to New Orleans for Elbert's deposition hearing. There, attorneys representing the insurance companies had approached Carla.
The attorneys had a conversation with her, something to the fact that, hey, we know that this guy's a fraud. They had been watching him.
They had asked her about testifying against him, and that way the insurance, they wouldn't have to pay all of this money.
That could be a huge motive to get rid of her.
Still, investigators have doubts that Elbert was the trigger man, since he was also injured in the attack.
You don't get tunnel vision. You don't focus on one person.
There was some idea that Holder was a scam artist and Carla got caught in crossfire.
Investigators start to wonder if Carla's murder could have been connected to Elbert because of some of the circles that he's been known to run in, and it could have potentially been aimed at him.
According to Carla's family, there was a recent incident where Carla and Elbert may have been targeted.
One of her cars was set on fire.
I'm like, Carla, how did your car catch a fire? The report in the fireman said it was set. And I'm like, Carla, what in the hell is going on?
Carla felt that the fire in the car was a technical issue or a malfunction of some sort, but her family had a suspicion that it could have been something that was meant for Elbert.
Elbert Holder had enemies, people that he maybe ripped off or wronged in some way.
The alarming thing is that Elbert didn't say anything about this, so maybe he didn't want detectives snooping into his case. But his fiancée is dead, so they know he's got to be hiding something.
Before investigators can confront Elbert about these claims, they receive a pivotal tip.
The woman called the police and said that she had loaned her car to somebody the night before.
The local woman tells police that her friend who had borrowed the car the night of the murder came back the next day in her own car and told her that they would have to go pick the car up.
The woman rode with her friend to get her car, which was parked at a rest stop along Highway 85, the same highway Carla was killed on. When they get to the car, it's got dirt on it, grass on it, so when she eventually does get it home, she naturally starts to clean it up. She tells police when she's in the process of cleaning her car up, she makes a very startling discovery.
She had discovered a shotgun in the trunk.
She said the person she loaned the car to was Brenda Dixon.
It so happens that Brenda Dixon was the ex-girlfriend of Elbert Holder and the mother of his son.
The sheriff's department immediately sent an officer out who recovered the gun from the trunk.
It turns out this woman's vehicle matches the description of the vehicle a witness saw out on the highway when authorities were initially canvassing the area, which was a lighter-colored sedan. It was shocking. A potential murder weapon had just fallen into their hands. Was Brenda Dixon the shooter?
"24 hours into the investigation of Carla Knowlton's murder, Arkansas police have recovered a shotgun from a car allegedly loaned to Brenda Dixon, the ex-girlfriend of Carla's fiancé, Elbert Holder.
While police have sent the shotgun off to the crime lab for testing, they're trying to locate Brenda Dixon, because naturally they'd like to talk to her. Brenda wasn't at home, so police started talking to friends and family, trying to locate anybody who could help them find her.
When investigators speak with Brenda's friends, they learn that Brenda and Elbert's relationship hadn't necessarily ended.
Mr. Holder was dating more than one lady. Mr. Holder was in a relationship with Carla Knowlton. He was also in a relationship with Brenda Dixon at the time.
They just never stopped dating, even though he was living with Carla.
Carla found out he never broke up with Brenda. He never broke up with her.
He was going from her house to Carla's house.
So it was like he was living a double life, but he did it so well.
We were very angry. He was not the guy for our sister.
Investigators theorize that Brenda may have enacted a plot to get rid of her romantic rival.
Jealousy is a powerful motivating factor in a lot of murders.
Brenda and Elbert's relationship was the relationship of the woman on the side. And maybe she thought that was going to come to an end if he married Carla. And you see this quite frequently where the woman on the side wants to eliminate the woman who is occupying the attention of who she would consider her man.
Was this a case of, if I can't have him, nobody can?
If Brenda was involved, the question is, what did Elbert know? Initially, it was said there were two men at the scene.
The first thought was, could Elbert be protecting Brenda?
The following day, investigators search for their main suspects, Elbert and Brenda. Shortly after, police receive a call from the woman who had previously loaned Brenda her vehicle.
The lady called the sheriff's office again, basically in a panic, saying that Mr. Holder and Miss Dixon were over there. They wanted to get in the trunk of the car, and she had told them that she lost the keys. She had actually tossed the keys to the trunk behind her couch.
As soon as Brenda Dixon and Elbert got out of earshot, she called the police.
She was really panicking about the whole situation, fearful for her life.
Investigators race to the scene, where they find their two primary suspects, Elbert and Brenda, standing at the woman's car with the trunk popped.
Holder had actually brought either a mechanic or a locksmith or somebody to try to open the trunk. He was totally surprised that the gun was no longer in the trunk.
Why is he out there retrieving the shotgun if he had no knowledge?
Elbert Holder and Brenda Dixon were arrested on the spot by law enforcement.
Brenda and Elbert are transported to the sheriff's office for questioning.
Elbert refused to talk to police and immediately asked for a lawyer.
Brenda Dixon, she started talking pretty quickly. She said that this was all Mr. Holder's idea and all his plan
She told them about her involvement, but that Elbert was really behind it all.
Miss Dixon said that Mr. Holder, he had approached her about killing the victim because Mr. Holder thought she was going to testify against him in an insurance fraud case.
According to Brenda, Carla had set conditions on her silence.
Carla wanted Elbert to really clean up his act and stop any scamming that he was doing, stop seeing Brenda, and settle down and marry her.
Brenda said Carla was forcing Elbert to marry her.
Elbert agreed to Carla's conditions, and then Carla was excited about moving forward with their life.
And she was so excited. Oh, I'm getting married, I'm getting married. We're getting married. But she was planning a wedding, and he was planning the funeral.
Brenda said that she was approached by Elbert, who said he wanted her to help. Brenda doesn't want her man to marry another woman and agrees with him to murder Carla to get her out of the way.
Originally, Elbert attempted to plant some sort of a bomb in Carla's car, but she dodged that attempt.
Brenda explained she refused to commit the murder herself, so Elbert enlisted the help of his friend, 43-year-old Greg Jenkins.
Brenda told us Holder came to him and asked him to do it and that he would pay Greg. And so he willingly agreed to do it.
I don't know if he got paid $2,000. I don't know if he got paid $10,000, but apparently he got paid money to do this.
According to Brenda, they met several times to talk about how they were going to do it. It was Friday, June the 22nd of 2001, that Jenkins, Dixon, and Holder finalized their plan to kill Carla.
Elbert's plan was to drive Carla to work the next night. And when he turned onto the desolate part of Highway 85, he was supposed to act as though there was car trouble, and that's when Greg Jenkins was supposed to be waiting.
When Elbert pulls over and then pops the hood, that's the signal to Greg Jenkins waiting nearby to come out and then shoot Carla. The plan was to make this appear like it was a robbery that had gone wrong.
Brenda claims that Elbert was never supposed to be injured, but he had taken steps to make his story more believable.
Brenda tells police that Elbert actually put a bullet in his own hat the day before the murder.
He took his cap off and shot it with a handgun. He would then just claim that he was another victim and he just got lucky and hadn't been killed himself.
On the night of the murder, Brenda says she borrowed her friend's car and picked up Greg Jenkins, who was armed with a 12-gauge shotgun.
Brenda told us. Greg said he could not do it unless he got drunk. Brenda's story was that they drove out to the Razorback liquor store. Greg got something to drink. They then drove down to Highway 85, and she dropped off Greg at the spot where Elbert told them they would meet. She then pulled up to the vacant house and stayed there and waited.
As Brenda was waiting, she saw the headlights coming down the road and then stopped at that location where they had chosen to shoot Carla.
She said that she did not see Greg actually pull the trigger and kill Carla, but that she heard 4 shots. And there was a grazed shot on Elbert's arm. And so that would have accounted for the 4 blasts she heard. But nobody ever said he stood there and Jenkins shot him or whether he shot himself.
According to Brenda Dixon, Greg Jenkins ran over to the vehicle that Miss Dixon was in, threw the gun in the truck, jumped in the car with her, and they fled the scene.
The next day, when Brenda realizes she had left the shotgun in the trunk of the car, she gets a hold of Elbert and says, "We've got to get this shotgun." By that time, though, it was too late.
And I think Dixon didn't know what to do with the firearm afterwards. The plan was, how do we make this murder happen? But there was no plan for what happens after the murder.
On August 14th, 2001, authorities charged Brenda Dixon and Elbert Holder with capital murder.
Capital murder is a murder that's premeditated where there are aggravating factors. Capital murder means that you face the death penalty.
At this point, the police, they go and pick up the alleged triggerman, Greg Jenkins, as well. Once Greg is in custody, he doesn't speak to police, and he immediately asks for a lawyer.
Mr. Jenkins was charged with the capital murder of Carla Knowlton.
Coming up, as the trials get underway, several issues threaten to upend the case and leave Carla's family and authorities baffled at its outcome.
She's got every motive to lie to try to get herself a sweet deal.
And I watched him walk out of court. I was just angry.
I don't know that you could find a case more tragic than this.
Arkansas, Brenda Dixon has confessed to conspiring with her lover, Elbert Holder, to murder Elbert's fiancée, Carla Knowlton.
According to Brenda, Mr. Holder hatched the whole plot, planned it, the location, and the whole 9 yards.
But I personally know Brenda. How could you even let him convince you to even do this?
The anger definitely kicked in with everybody, and then we kind of beat ourselves up because we knew he was no good.
While Carla's loved ones grapple with the tragedy, authorities continue building their case.
The key piece of evidence was Brenda Dixon's testimony, but she was a co-defendant. For that testimony to be given any weight or credibility at all, it has to be corroborated or substantiated by independent evidence.
The vehicle that Carla was killed in was examined. There was no evidence that the car had any kind of engine trouble. So the story that Elbert gave that they pulled over for car trouble, clearly fabricated.
Police were also able to confirm that Elbert did own a .38 caliber revolver, and they found that revolver not too far from the crime scene.
His hat's got a bullet hole. The crime lab determined that the hole in the hat was consistent with a .38 caliber revolver.
The crime lab confirms that the shotgun found in the trunk is in fact the murder weapon.
There was no DNA or any other kind of physical evidence that linked Greg Jenkins or anybody else to the weapon. Greg Jenkins never confessed to a crime, and the only thing investigators actually had against him was Brenda's story.
As news of the arrest sweeps across Helena, a witness comes forward alleging Greg Jenkins had confessed to shooting Carla Knowlton.
He told me flat out that Jenkins had come to him afterwards, sad, and said I should not have let Holder get me to kill Carla. I should not have done it. So we had that. The trial of Elbert Holder started the morning of May the 20th of 2002 in the Phillips County Courthouse in Helena, Arkansas. We were very confident going to this trial.
Prosecutors assert that Elbert had a clear motive for wanting Carla dead.
Carla Knowlton was scheduled to be a witness against Elbert Holder down in Louisiana. Turned out that was a big part of the motive. Elbert Holder had asked several people to get rid of Miss Knowlton, and he needed her gone by a certain date, which was just prior to when he was scheduled to go to trial on the insurance fraud case down in Louisiana.
The state's star witness is Brenda Dixon, who directly implicates her lover in the plot to kill Carla. Elbert's defense, however, attempts to pin the murder entirely on Brenda.
Brenda Dixon couldn't be believed, according to the defense, because she's a co-defendant and she's charged herself. So she's got every motive to lie to try to get herself a sweet deal.
You could look at the motive as being jealousy and that Brenda had a larger role than she let on. Or you could look at it as a man selfishly trying to protect himself. Or maybe it was a combination of the two.
After hearing the testimony, the jurors retire to deliberate.
The jury returned a verdict of guilty to capital murder.
I think he narrowly escaped receiving the death penalty from the jury, but he received a sentence of life in prison without parole.
He did appeal it, and then they went back and just gave him 40 years. And I said either way, he'll die in prison. So we were okay with the judgment.
Greg Jenkins' trial gets underway 4 months later.
Miss Dixon's testimony was a big part of the evidence against Mr. Jenkins, but there was other evidence against him as well.
One of the proprietors of the Razorback liquor store verified that Greg came into the liquor store that night and bought liquor, and there was a person who lived at the South Beach Apartments who testified that he saw Brenda drop off Greg that night at some time after the murder occurred.
Another key witness for prosecutors is the man who claimed Greg Jenkins had confessed that he regretted killing Carla.
I was the person who examined him, put him on the witness stand. He said, no, that's not true. That didn't happen. And so I asked him 5 different ways. You know, isn't it true that you told me this? Isn't it true that he came to you? No, that's not what happened. That was disappointing for me.
The witness's testimony, along with the lack of physical evidence tying Greg to the murder, result in a frustrating outcome for prosecutors.
He was found not guilty.
Mr. Jenkins was acquitted. He's a free man as we sit here today. The investigators were very thorough, a very solid case on Mr. Jenkins, but the jury just didn't see it that way.
When they said not guilty and how he cheered, his mother cheered, and I watched him walk out of court, I was just angry.
I don't think justice was served in his being found not guilty.
For her role in Carla's murder, Brenda Dixon is sentenced to 10 years in prison.
Elbert definitely needed help to execute this plan. He couldn't necessarily have done it alone. So Brenda was a very important part of the plan.
Mr. Holder got her involved in this scheme that he hatched in his head. I personally talked to Miss Dixon several times over the course of these 2 trials and appeared to feel a lot of remorse that she'd made a horrible mistake and she wished it hadn't happened.
I don't know that you could find a case more tragic than this, because everybody lost. Nobody should have to lose their life. But for simple greed, it's even worse.
Sometimes you can be sleeping with a snake and don't even know it. So just be careful. And if you see any red flags, don't ignore them, because they're there for a reason.
The village did not look like a place where violence could take root. It sat quietly on the edge of the sea, small and unassuming. The kind of place where routines rarely changed and strangers were noticed immediately. In a community like that, people believe, perhaps without ever saying it out loud, that nothing truly catastrophic could happen. Life unfolded in predictable patterns. Neighbors recognized each other by sight, by voice, by habit. Doors were not always locked. The rhythm of daily life moved slowly, almost gently, and for the people who lived there, that rhythm was a kind of reassurance. It suggested stability. It suggested safety. But on November 13th, 1990, that sense of safety began to unravel, not all at once, but in fragments. Small moments of confusion that quickly gave way to something far more terrifying. It began, as many tragedies do, with something that seemed insignificant, a disagreement. Raised voices, the kind of confrontation that might normally dissipate as quickly as it appeared. There was nothing in that moment to suggest that what followed would escalate into one of the deadliest mass shootings in the history of New Zealand. The event now known as the Aramoana massacre. At first, there was uncertainty, a sound that didn't quite belong. For some, it registered as distant, indistinct. For others, it was sharper, more immediate. But in a place where hunting was not unheard of, the initial reaction was not panic. It was confusion. People paused, listened, tried to make sense of what they were hearing. Was it a firearm? Was it nearby? Was it even relevant? That hesitation, the brief space between perception and understanding, would become one of the defining features of the unfolding tragedy. Because by the time the reality became clear, it was already too late. What no one could have known at that moment was that a man named David Gray had made a decision that would not only alter his own fate, but the lives of everyone in that community. Gray was not a stranger to Aramoana. He lived there, though not in the same way others did. He was known, but not necessarily understood. People had seen him, had interacted with him in passing, had formed impressions, some uneasy, some dismissive, but nothing that, on its own, predicted what was about to happen. Yet beneath the surface there were signs, a pattern of isolation, a temper that could shift unpredictably, a sense among some residents that something about him was off, though difficult to define. These were observations, not conclusions. And in a small community, such impressions often remained unspoken, filed away as quirks rather than warnings. As the afternoon progressed, those quiet uncertainties began to collide with a reality no one had prepared for. The first confirmed act of violence shattered whatever ambiguity remained. A woman named Evelyn Rooney, one of Gray's neighbors, became the first victim. Her death was not just a singular act. It was the beginning of a sequence, a chain reaction that would continue to unfold with increasing speed and brutality. From that point forward, the situation changed completely. This was no longer a misunderstanding, no longer a question of isolated conflict. It was something else entirely, something moving, unpredictable, and escalating. Gray did not stay in one place. He moved through the village, carrying weapons, targeting people without clear distinction. There was no pattern that others could anticipate, no logic that could be followed. The randomness itself became a weapon. For the residents, the lack of information was almost as dangerous as the violence itself. People did not know where he was. They did not know who had already been harmed. They did not know whether it was safe to leave their homes or whether staying inside would make them more vulnerable. Each decision carried risk, and there was no way to measure it. In those early moments, communication was fragmented. There was no immediate, coordinated understanding of the scale of what was happening. Some individuals attempted to help others, stepping outside to check on neighbors, to offer assistance, to make sense of the chaos. Others instinctively withdrew, seeking shelter, closing doors, turning off lights, trying to disappear into silence. These were not calculated strategies. They were human responses, improvised, urgent, and shaped by fear. As the hours passed, the reality of the situation became harder to ignore. The sounds continued. Not a single isolated incident, but repeated, sustained. Each report of gunfire reinforced the same conclusion. This was ongoing. And yet, even as that realization spread, clarity remained elusive. Where was the threat? How close was it? Was it moving toward them or away from them? The absence of answers amplified the fear, turning uncertainty into something almost tangible. For the people inside those homes, time began to stretch. Minutes felt longer. Every noise carried weight. A footstep, a creak, the distant echo of something that might, or might not, be another shot. The mind, searching for patterns, found none. And in that void, imagination filled the gaps, often with worst-case scenarios. It is difficult to reconstruct exactly what each individual experienced in those moments. But certain themes emerge consistently. A sense of disbelief at first, then a growing awareness. Then fear, sharp, immediate, and persistent. And beneath it all, a single, unanswerable question. How could this be happening here? The idea that such violence could emerge from within the community itself challenged fundamental assumptions. This was not an external threat. It was not something arriving from outside. It was already there, embedded, unnoticed or underestimated until it was too late. And that realization carried its own kind of weight. One that would linger long after the events themselves had ended. As daylight began to fade, the situation took on a different character. Darkness introduced new uncertainties. Visibility decreased. The environment itself became more difficult to navigate, both for those in danger and for those attempting to respond. And still, the movement of the gunman remained unclear. The lack of a fixed location meant that no area could be considered entirely safe. Even silence became suspect. Was it over? Had he left? Or was he waiting? For many residents, the night was not a period of rest, but one of endurance. Staying awake, listening, trying to interpret every sound without drawing attention. The psychological strain of that experience cannot be overstated. It was not just fear of immediate harm, but the sustained pressure of not knowing when or if it would come. Outside the village, the situation was beginning to draw attention. Law enforcement had been alerted, but the initial response was complicated by the same lack of information that affected the residents. What exactly were they dealing with? How many victims were there? Was this a single shooter? Was it contained or still spreading? These questions took time to answer, and during that time, the threat remained active. The gap between the onset of violence and the full mobilization of an effective response would become one of the critical elements in understanding the event as a whole. But in those early hours, from the perspective of those on the ground, the larger picture was inaccessible. There was only the immediate reality, uncertainty, fear, and the knowledge that something had gone terribly wrong. The Aramoana massacre did not begin with a grand declaration or a clear signal. It began quietly, almost invisibly, and then escalated beyond anyone's expectations. By the time its true nature was recognized, it had already reshaped the community in irreversible ways. And as the night settled in, one fact became increasingly clear, whatever this was. It was not over yet. Aramoana was the kind of place where familiarity shaped everything. It was small, close-knit, and defined less by geography than by the relationships between the people who lived there. In communities like this, identity is shared. People are not just individuals. They are neighbors, friends, familiar faces encountered in passing, voices recognized without needing to turn around. There's a quiet understanding that everyone belongs, even if some stand slightly at the edges. Daily life followed patterns that felt dependable. People moved through their routines with a sense of ease that came from repetition. Meals were prepared at regular times. Conversations happened across fences or along narrow roads. And the presence of others created a kind of informal safety net. There was no expectation of danger, not because it was impossible, but because it had never been experienced in a way that forced people to prepare for it. Safety in Aramoana was not actively constructed. It was assumed. On the day before the violence, nothing marked the village as different from any other quiet coastal community. There were no warnings, no signs that something irreversible was about to occur. The normalcy of that setting is essential to understanding the impact of what followed, because it highlights the scale of disruption. When violence entered Aramoana, it did not just harm individuals. It fractured the underlying sense of trust that held the community together. The victims of the massacre were not strangers brought together by coincidence. They were part of that shared fabric. 13 people lost their lives, and among them were neighbors, members of families, individuals who had been part of the everyday landscape of the village. Some were at home, engaged in ordinary activities. Others were moving through the village, perhaps unaware that anything unusual was happening. There were also children among the victims, a detail that underscores the indiscriminate nature of the violence. These were not people connected by a single event or location. They were connected by proximity, by community, by the simple fact of living in the same place. What makes their loss particularly devastating is not only the number, but the context. In a small community, every loss is amplified. There are fewer degrees of separation. Each death reverberates outward, touching multiple lives directly. The absence of one person is felt by many, and when that absence multiplies, the impact becomes almost impossible to contain. It alters how people see their environment, how they relate to one another, and how they understand the concept of safety itself. To speak about the victims in this case is to acknowledge that they were not defined by the manner of their deaths. They were individuals with routines, relationships, and roles within their community. The available information does not provide detailed personal histories for each of them, but it does make clear that they were ordinary people, people who did not anticipate becoming part of a violent event. That ordinariness is precisely what makes the tragedy so profound. It reinforces the idea that the violence was not targeted in a conventional sense. It did not arise from a specific grievance against a clearly defined group. Instead, it unfolded in a way that made anyone in the vicinity a potential victim. This randomness created a form of vulnerability that extended to everyone in the community. At the center of this context is David Gray, a figure who both belonged to the community and stood apart from it. He lived in Aramoana, but his relationship to the place was markedly different from that of his neighbors. He was known, but not integrated. His presence was familiar, yet his behavior often set him at a distance. He lived alone, without stable employment, and his living conditions reflected a level of neglect that others found difficult to ignore. His house was described as being in poor condition, cluttered, and unsanitary. A physical environment that mirrored, at least in part, the internal state that observers would later attempt to piece together. Gray's interactions with others were inconsistent. There were moments when he appeared relatively normal, but these were interspersed with episodes of anger and volatility. He could become agitated quickly, reacting strongly to situations that others might consider minor. Over time, this pattern contributed to a growing sense of unease among those who lived nearby. It did not necessarily lead to direct confrontation or formal intervention, but did shape how people perceived him. He was, in many ways, an outsider within a small community that valued cohesion. This position, being present but not fully connected, can create its own set of dynamics. Isolation, whether chosen or imposed, often changes how individuals interpret their surroundings. In Gray's case, there were indications of paranoia, a belief that others were encroaching on his space or acting against him in some way. These perceptions were not confirmed through any formal diagnosis prior to the incident, but they were part of the broader pattern that emerged from accounts of his behavior. The sense of being threatened, whether real or imagined, can intensify over time, especially in the absence of stabilizing influences or support systems. It is important to approach this aspect with caution. The presence of mental health concerns does not equate to violence, and the vast majority of individuals experiencing such issues do not engage in harmful behavior. However, in this specific case, the available information suggests that Gray's mental state was a contributing factor in how he interpreted and responded to his environment. His feelings of anger, combined with a perception of being wronged or provoked, appear to have accumulated over time. Without intervention or resolution, that accumulation may have reached a critical point. The community, for its part, did not have a framework for addressing this kind of situation. There were no clear mechanisms in place to manage individuals who exhibited troubling behavior, but had not committed a crime. In small communities, social regulation often takes informal forms: avoidance, quiet concern, unspoken boundaries. These methods can be effective in maintaining general harmony, but they're limited when it comes to addressing deeper, more complex issues. As a result, Gray remained within the community, visible but not fully engaged. His behavior noted but not systematically addressed. This context is essential because it highlights the intersection between individual circumstances and collective environment. The tragedy that unfolded in Aramoana was not solely the result of a single moment. It was the culmination of multiple factors, personal, social, and structural, that converged in a way that no one fully anticipated. The victims were part of a community that functioned on trust and familiarity. The perpetrator was part of that same community, but existed on its margins, carrying a set of internal conflicts that were not resolved. When the violence began, it did not distinguish between these roles. It cut across them, disrupting the entire system at once. Understanding the victims and the context in which they lived does not provide a simple explanation for what happened, but it does clarify the scale of the loss. It shows that this was not an isolated incident affecting a distant or disconnected group. It was an event that emerged from within a community, impacting people who were deeply embedded in their environment. Their lives were ordinary, their routines familiar, and their expectations shaped by a sense of security that had not been previously challenged. When that security was broken, it left behind more than physical damage. It altered the psychological landscape of the community, creating a lasting sense of vulnerability that would persist long after the immediate events had ended. The events of November 13th, 1990 did not begin with a dramatic escalation, but rather with a moment that, in isolation, might have seemed unremarkable. In the afternoon, a dispute took place between David Gray and his neighbors, involving issues that were, on the surface, mundane, dogs and rubbish. These were not uncommon sources of tension in close-knit communities where boundaries, both physical and social, are constantly negotiated. But for Gray, this exchange did not dissipate like a typical argument. According to the available accounts, he felt deeply provoked, insulted in a way that resonated beyond the immediate situation. What followed was not a continuation of the argument, but a withdrawal. Gray returned to his house. At that point, there was still an opportunity for the situation to end, for the confrontation to fade into the background of daily life. Instead, it marked the transition from conflict to violence. Inside his home, Gray armed himself. He retrieved multiple firearms, including a semi-automatic rifle, along with ammunition. This action represented a clear shift in intent. It was no longer about confrontation or communication. It was about preparation. When he emerged again, he did so with the means to carry out lethal force, and without any indication that he intended to restrain it. The first act of violence was directed at a neighbor, Evelyn Rooney. She became the initial victim, marking the point at which the situation moved irreversibly into a mass casualty event. The killing did not stop there. What followed was a rapid expansion of violence, both in scope and in unpredictability. Gray did not remain at a single location. Instead, he moved through the village, armed and active, engaging in what can only be described as indiscriminate shooting. Individuals encountered in open spaces were targeted. People inside their homes were not insulated from the threat. In several instances, Gray entered residential properties, turning private spaces into sites of violence. This movement through multiple environments, public and private, contributed to the overall sense of chaos. There was no clear boundary between safe and unsafe areas. The absence of a fixed location for the shooter meant that residents could not rely on distance or concealment as reliable forms of protection. As the violence unfolded, it intersected with ordinary life in abrupt and devastating ways. Some victims were engaged in routine activities, such as preparing or eating meals. Others were moving through the village, possibly responding to the sounds they were hearing or attempting to assist others. In at least one instance, an individual who tried to help a neighbor was shot. These actions highlight a critical aspect of the incident, the breakdown of normal social responses. In most situations, people are inclined to assist one another in times of distress. In this case, those instincts placed individuals at immediate risk. because the threat did not operate according to recognizable patterns. It did not allow for intervention or negotiation. It was immediate and lethal. The randomness of the attacks played a central role in shaping the experience of those present. Gray did not appear to select targets based on a consistent or identifiable criterion. Instead, the violence extended to anyone within his reach. This lack of selectivity removed any sense of predictability. Residents could not assess their level of risk based on prior relationships or interactions. Familiarity offered no protection. The result was a pervasive sense of vulnerability that extended across the entire community. As the afternoon progressed, the cumulative effect of these actions began to alter the collective understanding of the situation. What may have initially been interpreted as isolated incidents gradually coalesced into a recognition that something far more serious was occurring. However, this recognition was uneven. Not everyone received information at the same time, and communication within the village was limited. Some individuals were already aware of the danger, while others remained uncertain. Tried to interpret fragmented signals. This disparity contributed to the overall confusion. People responded based on incomplete information, making decisions in real time without a clear understanding of the broader context. The responses varied. Some individuals attempted to leave the area, moving toward open spaces such as the beach, where they believed they might be safer or more visible. Others chose to remain inside their homes, locking doors, turning off lights, and minimizing noise in an effort to avoid detection. There were also those who attempted to contact authorities or warn others, actions that required exposure to potential danger. Each of these responses reflects a different interpretation of risk, shaped by immediate perception rather than coordinated guidance. The absence of centralized information meant that individuals were effectively operating independently, each trying to navigate a rapidly evolving situation. The sounds of gunfire continued over an extended period. This continuity reinforced the understanding that the threat was ongoing. It was not a single event that had concluded, but a sequence that remained active. For those sheltering in place, this created a sustained period of psychological stress. The unpredictability of the shooter's movements meant that silence could not be interpreted as safety. At any moment, the situation could shift again. The internal environment of each home became a space of tension, where even minor noises carried potential consequences. People adjusted their behavior accordingly, reducing movement, limiting communication, and focusing on remaining unnoticed. As time passed, the spatial dynamics of the incident became increasingly complex. Gray's movement through the village made it difficult for anyone, residents or responders, to establish a clear map of the threat. Without a fixed point of origin, the violence appeared to be dispersed, emerging in different locations without a consistent pattern. This dispersion complicated any attempt to predict where the next act might occur. It also increased the emotional impact, as it suggested that the entire area was compromised. There was no clear perimeter, no defined zone of safety. The transition into evening introduced additional challenges. Reduced visibility affected both perception and response. For residents, the darkness amplified uncertainty. Visual confirmation of safety or danger became more difficult, increasing reliance on auditory cues, which are themselves ambiguous. For the perpetrator, the conditions may have provided additional concealment, though the available information does not specify his exact movements during this period. What is clear is that the lack of visibility contributed to a continuation of fear. Even in the absence of constant activity, the uncertainty persisted. At some point during the evening, Gray ceased his visible movement through the village and was no longer actively encountered by residents. However, this did not resolve the situation. Instead, it introduced a different form of tension. Without knowing his location, residents could not determine whether the threat had ended or simply shifted. The possibility that he remained nearby, concealed and waiting, prevented any sense of relief. People remained in their chosen places of refuge, maintaining the same level of caution as before. The duration of the event is a critical factor in understanding its impact. Unlike incidents that occur over a short, clearly defined period, this sequence extended over several hours and into the following day. This extended time frame allowed fear to accumulate and stabilize, rather than dissipate. It also meant that the experience was not confined to a single moment, but unfolded in stages, each reinforcing the previous one. By the time night fully set in, the situation had evolved from confusion to recognition, from recognition to fear, and from fear to endurance. The events of November 13th did not conclude with a clear endpoint. Instead, they transitioned into a period of uncertainty that carried forward into the next day. The incident, as it was experienced by those present, was not a single burst of violence, but a sustained disruption of normal life, marked by unpredictability, isolation, and the constant possibility of further harm. The response to the unfolding violence in Aramoana began under conditions of uncertainty that significantly shaped the course of events. When the first calls reached authorities, the information was fragmented and incomplete. Reports of gunfire did not immediately translate into an understanding of a large-scale, ongoing attack. Instead, the situation was initially interpreted within the framework of more limited incidents, possibly a domestic dispute, possibly an isolated act of violence. This early ambiguity delayed the formation of a coordinated response, not because of negligence, but because the available data did not yet reveal the full scope of what was happening. Officers from nearby Dunedin were dispatched, entering an environment that was already unstable. They were responding to a situation that was still evolving, with no clear perimeter and no confirmed pattern of activity. As they approached the village, they were operating without the benefit of detailed intelligence. They did not know how many victims there were, how many shooters might be involved, or whether the threat was contained or still moving. This lack of clarity influenced their initial positioning and tactics. Without confirmation of a mass casualty event, the level of preparedness reflected a more conventional response. It quickly became apparent that this assessment was insufficient. As officers encountered the aftermath, evidence of multiple victims, indications of continued gunfire, the situation was reassessed. The realization that they were dealing with a mobile, heavily armed individual introduced a new set of challenges. The environment itself complicated matters. Aramoana's layout, with its scattered homes and limited infrastructure, made it difficult to establish control or containment. There were multiple points of entry and exit, and the absence of a central location for the suspect meant that traditional methods of securing a scene were not immediately applicable. One of the most significant difficulties faced by responding officers was the mobility of David Gray. Unlike a scenario in which a suspect remains in a fixed location, Gray's movement through the village created a constantly shifting threat. This movement not only increased the number of potential victims, but also made it difficult for law enforcement to predict his actions. Officers had to consider the possibility that he could appear in any direction at any time. This unpredictability forced a more cautious approach, limiting the ability to advance quickly or engage directly without exposing themselves to significant risk. At least one officer came dangerously close to being shot during these early stages, an indication of how volatile the situation had become. The lack of specialized equipment further complicated the response. At that time, local police were not routinely equipped for confronting a heavily armed individual in an active shooting scenario. Protective gear was limited, and the available firearms were not necessarily suited to countering a suspect with access to semi-automatic weapons. This imbalance in equipment influenced decision-making. Officers had to weigh the urgency of intervention against the risk of escalating casualties, including their own. As a result, there were moments where containment and observation took precedence over direct engagement, not as a matter of hesitation, but as a tactical necessity. Communication during this period was critical, but also constrained. Information had to be gathered, verified, and transmitted under pressure. Reports from residents were often inconsistent, shaped by limited visibility and heightened fear. Each new piece of information had to be evaluated for accuracy before it could inform operational decisions. This process, while essential, introduced delays that were difficult to avoid. At the same time, the need to coordinate multiple responding units added another layer of complexity. Ensuring that officers were aware of each other's positions, avoiding crossfire, and maintaining a coherent strategy required constant attention. As the scale of the incident became undeniable, the decision was made to involve a specialized tactical unit. The New Zealand Special Tactics Group, trained for high-risk situations involving armed suspects, was mobilized. Their deployment marked a shift in the approach to the situation. While local officers had focused on immediate response and containment, the Special Tactics Group brought a level of planning and capability designed for deliberate intervention. However, their arrival did not immediately resolve the situation. The conditions on the ground still had to be assessed, and a strategy had to be developed based on the most current information available. By the time the Special Tactics Group was fully engaged, the incident had already extended into the evening. Darkness introduced additional challenges, reducing visibility and complicating movement. The suspect's exact location remained uncertain, and the possibility that he could relocate again had to be considered. Under these circumstances, a cautious approach was maintained. Immediate assault without sufficient intelligence could have resulted in further casualties. Instead, efforts were made to gather information, establish a clearer understanding of the suspect's position, and prepare for controlled engagement. The transition from night to morning brought a change in conditions that allowed for more effective action, with improved visibility and a more comprehensive understanding of the situation. Attention focused on identifying Gray's location. At some point during this process, it was determined that he had returned to his residence. This information provided a critical anchor for the operation. For the first time since the violence began, there was a fixed point around which a strategy could be organized. The mobility that had defined the earlier stages of the incident was no longer a factor, and this allowed for a shift from reactive to proactive tactics. The area surrounding the house was secured to the extent possible, with officers positioning themselves to contain the suspect. This phase required careful coordination. The goal was to prevent escape while minimizing the risk to both officers and any remaining civilians. Communication within the tactical unit was precise, with each movement planned and executed in relation to the others. The uncertainty that had characterized the initial response was gradually replaced by a more structured approach, though the inherent danger of the situation remained. As officers moved closer to the residence, the potential for confrontation increased. Gray was still armed, and there was no indication that he intended to surrender. The possibility of negotiation appears to have been limited by the circumstances. The nature of the preceding events, combined with the suspect's behavior, suggested that any attempt at dialogue would carry significant risk and uncertain outcomes. The decision-making process at this stage was guided by the need to bring the situation to a conclusion while preventing further loss of life. When a final confrontation occurred, it took the form of an exchange of gunfire. Gray fired at the approaching officers, confirming that he remained actively hostile. The response from the Special Tactics Group was immediate. Trained for precisely this type of engagement, they acted to neutralize the threat. The duration of the exchange is not detailed in the available data, but its outcome is clear. Gray was shot and killed. This marked the end of the active phase of the incident. The threat, which had persisted for nearly a full day, was finally contained. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the focus shifted to securing the scene and accounting for the victims. The scale of the tragedy became fully apparent. 13 people had lost their lives, and others had been injured. The physical danger had ended, but the process of understanding and responding to the consequences was only beginning. The investigation, in its formal sense, would continue beyond this point, examining the sequence of events, the actions taken by both the perpetrator and the responders, and the broader factors that contributed to the outcome. However, the critical turning points had already occurred. The initial underestimation of the situation, the challenges posed by a mobile shooter, the limitations in equipment and information, and the eventual transition to a specialized tactical response all played defining roles in shaping how the incident unfolded. The final phase of the Aramoana massacre did not unfold in a courtroom, nor did it conclude with a traditional legal process. Unlike many criminal cases that move from investigation to arrest and ultimately to trial, this case reached its resolution in the field, at the point of direct confrontation between the perpetrator and law enforcement. By the morning of November 14, 1990, the situation had shifted from uncertainty to a more defined objective: locating and stopping David Gray. After hours of confusion, fear, and fragmented response, authorities had determined that Gray had returned to his residence. This development marked a critical turning point. For the first time since the violence began, the threat was no longer moving unpredictably through the village. It was contained, at least geographically, within a specific location. The arrival and deployment of a New Zealand Special Tactics Group signaled a transition to a more controlled and deliberate operation. Unlike the initial responders, who had been forced to react in real time with limited information and equipment, the Special Tactics Group approached the situation with specialized training and a structure plan. Their objective was clear: neutralize the threat while minimizing further risk to both civilians and officers. The house itself became the focal point of the operation. Surrounding it required careful coordination, ensuring that all possible exit points were covered while maintaining a safe distance. The uncertainty that had characterized the earlier stages of the incident had not entirely disappeared. Gray was still armed, and there was no indication that he would surrender peacefully. Every movement toward the house carried the potential for escalation. The officers involved had to balance the urgency of ending the situation with the need to avoid unnecessary exposure. As the perimeter was established, the possibility of negotiation remained uncertain. The available information does not indicate that any extended dialogue took place. And given the nature of the preceding events, it is difficult to assess whether such an approach would have been viable. Gray had already demonstrated a willingness to use lethal force repeatedly and without apparent restraint. This pattern of behavior suggested that he remained a continuing and immediate threat. Under these conditions, the decision-making process leaned toward direct intervention rather than prolonged engagement. When officers began to move closer to the residence, the situation escalated rapidly. Gray responded by opening fire, confirming that he was not only armed but actively resisting. This moment effectively removed any remaining ambiguity. The operation had shifted from containment to active confrontation. The Special Tactics Group, trained for precisely this type of scenario, responded with force. The exchange of gunfire that followed was the culmination of nearly a full day of violence. It was brief in comparison to the preceding hours, but decisive. Gray was shot and killed during the confrontation. With his death, the immediate threat came to an end. There was no arrest, no formal charges, no trial. The legal process that would typically follow such a series of crimes was rendered unnecessary by the outcome. In this sense, the resolution of the case was both immediate and incomplete. Immediate, because the perpetrator was no longer able to cause harm. Incomplete, because the absence of a trial meant that many questions would never be explored within a formal judicial setting. There would be no testimony from the perpetrator, no cross-examination, no detailed legal reconstruction of motive or intent presented in court. Instead, the understanding of the event would rely on the investigation conducted by authorities and the accounts of those who survived. In the hours following the confrontation, law enforcement shifted focus from engagement to documentation. The scene had to be secured, the extent of the damage assessed, and the victims accounted for. This process was methodical, but it also carried a significant emotional weight. The scale of the tragedy became fully visible. 13 individuals had lost their lives, and others had been injured. Each location within the village where violence had occurred became part of a larger narrative, one that investigators would piece together to understand the sequence of events. Without a trial, the investigative process took on an even greater importance. It became the primary means through which the incident would be analyzed and recorded. Authorities examined the timeline, the movements of the perpetrator, the response of law enforcement, and the broader circumstances that allowed the situation to develop as it did. This examination was not about determining guilt. Gray's actions had already established that, but about understanding how such an event could occur and what could be learned from it. The absence of a courtroom also meant that the families of the victims did not have the opportunity to see a conventional form of justice carried out. There was no sentencing, no formal acknowledgement of guilt within a judicial framework. For some, this may have complicated the process of closure. The resolution, while definitive in practical terms, lacked the procedural elements that often accompany the end of a criminal case. Instead, the focus shifted to remembrance, to the recognition of those who had been lost, and to the broader implications of the tragedy. From a legal perspective, the case concluded with the death of the perpetrator. There were no further charges to be filed, no additional suspects to pursue. The responsibility for the violence rested entirely with Gray, and his death marked the end of any direct legal action. However, the impact of the case extended beyond this point. It raised questions about preparedness, about the availability of firearms, and about the systems in place to identify and respond to individuals exhibiting concerning behavior. These questions would not be answered in a courtroom, but in the policy decisions and institutional changes that followed. The resolution of the Aramoana massacre, therefore, exists in two forms. The first is immediate and concrete, the confrontation at the residence, the exchange of gunfire, and the death of the perpetrator. The second is more diffuse, unfolding over time through investigation, reflection, and reform. Together, they represent the conclusion of the event as both a criminal act and a societal turning point. There was no final verdict delivered by a judge, no formal declaration of guilt beyond what had already been demonstrated through actions. Instead, the ending was defined by silence, the cessation of violence, the absence of further threat, and the beginning of a process that would attempt to make sense of what had happened. The end of the Aramoana massacre did not bring with it a sense of closure in the way that people often imagine when a violent event concludes. The gunfire had stopped, the perpetrator was dead, and the immediate threat had been eliminated. But what remained was something far more complex and enduring. In a small community like Aramoana, the aftermath was not contained to a single location or a limited group of individuals. It spread outward, touching every resident in different ways, altering not only their memories of the event, but their understanding of the place they lived in. The village itself had been transformed, not physically in every sense, but psychologically. The familiarity that once defined it now carried an undercurrent of unease. Spaces that had previously been neutral or even comforting were now associated with fear, loss, and uncertainty. For those who survived, the experience did not end when the violence stopped. Many had spent hours in hiding, unsure if they would be discovered, unsure if they would survive. That kind of sustained fear leaves an imprint. It changes how people respond to sound, to movement, to silence. The ordinary becomes uncertain. A noise that might once have been ignored becomes something to analyze, to question. Even in the absence of immediate danger, the body and mind can remain in a heightened state of alertness. This is one of the less visible consequences of such events, but it is no less significant than the physical damage. The loss of 13 lives, including children, created a collective grief that was both shared and deeply personal. In a larger city, the impact of a tragedy might be distributed across a wider population. But in a small community, it is concentrated. Each person who was lost had connections, family members, friends, neighbors, and those connections overlapped. Grief, in this context, does not exist in isolation. It is reinforced through repeated interactions, through the constant awareness of absence. There are empty spaces where people once were, routines that no longer include certain individuals, conversations that cannot happen again. Over time, communities find ways to adapt, but the process is neither quick nor straightforward. It involves a redefinition of what normal means, a gradual reconstruction of a sense of safety that can never fully return to its original form. Beyond the immediate emotional impact, the massacre prompted a broader reflection at the national level. It forced a reconsideration of existing systems and assumptions, particularly in relation to firearm ownership and law enforcement preparedness. Prior to the event, the regulatory framework surrounding firearms allowed for access to weapons that, in this case, were used to carry out prolonged and widespread violence. In the aftermath, this framework was reevaluated. Changes were introduced to restrict access to certain types of firearms, including semi-automatic weapons, and to strengthen the processes involved in background checks and registration. These measures were not implemented in isolation, but as part of a broader effort to reduce the likelihood of similar events occurring in the future. The goal was not to eliminate risk entirely, a task that is effectively impossible, but to create barriers that would make it more difficult for such violence to be carried out. At the same time, the response capabilities of law enforcement were examined. The challenges faced by officers during the initial stages of the incident highlighted gaps in equipment, training, and coordination. In response, efforts were made to enhance these areas. Police units were better equipped, both in terms of protective gear and weaponry, and specialized teams capable of responding to high-risk situations were expanded and more clearly integrated into the overall structure. Training protocols were updated to address scenarios involving active shooters, emphasizing rapid assessment, communication, and coordinated action. These changes reflected an understanding that the nature of certain threats had evolved, and that responses needed to evolve as well. The psychological dimension of the event also became a point of focus. The behavior of David Gray raised questions about how individuals with signs of instability are identified and supported within a community. While it is important to avoid simplistic conclusions, particularly the assumption that mental health issues inevitably lead to violence, the case did highlight the potential consequences of unaddressed distress combined with access to lethal means. Discussions around mental health awareness, community responsibility, and early intervention gained greater prominence. The aim was not to assign blame retrospectively, but to consider how similar situations might be recognized and managed more effectively in the future. These reflections extended beyond Aramoana, influencing conversations across New Zealand about the balance between individual rights and collective safety, about the role of communities in monitoring and supporting their members, and about the responsibilities of institutions in responding to emerging risks. Over time, the Aramoana massacre came to be understood not only as a tragic event, but as a turning point. It marked a moment when underlying assumptions were challenged, when the gap between perceived safety and actual vulnerability became impossible to ignore. This legacy is complex. On one hand, it is rooted in loss and trauma. On the other, it has contributed to changes that may reduce the likelihood of similar events in the future. The comparison to later incidents, such as the Christchurch mosque shootings, underscores this dual nature. While each event has its own context and dynamics, they are connected by a shared need to understand and respond to extreme acts of violence. The earlier tragedy at Aramoana provided a foundation for some of the measures that would later be expanded or reinforced. In this sense, its impact extends beyond its immediate time frame, influencing how the country continues to address issues of security and resilience. Yet, for all the structural changes and policy discussions, the core of the story remains the people who were lost and the community that was altered. It is easy, over time, for focus to shift towards systems and outcomes. But those elements exist because of what happened to individuals. 13 lives ended abruptly, without warning, in a place where such an outcome had never been seriously considered. Their absence is the most direct and lasting consequence of the event. Remembering them is not about revisiting the details of the violence, but about acknowledging the scale of what was taken and the context in which it occurred. The Aramoana massacre resists simple explanations. It cannot be reduced to a single cause or a single failure. It is the result of multiple factors intersecting in a way that produced an outcome far beyond what any one element might have suggested. Understanding it requires attention to those factors, but also an acceptance that not every question will have a clear answer. Why did the situation escalate at that particular moment? Why were the warning signs insufficient to prompt intervention? Why did the response unfold as it did? These are questions that can be explored, but not definitively resolved. In the end, what remains is a narrative that is both specific and universal. Specific in its details, the location, the individuals, the sequence of events. Universal in its themes, the fragility of safety, the impact of violence, the challenge of prevention. It is a reminder that even in places defined by stability and familiarity, there exists the potential for disruption, and it raises a question that continues to resonate. How can communities recognize and address that potential before it becomes reality? If we treat this as a seventh and final segment, it functions best not as a continuation of events, but as an epilogue, something that steps back from the structure of the case and examines what lingers after all the facts have been laid out. Because when a story like the Aramoana massacre is told from beginning to end, there is a natural expectation that understanding will follow. That by reconstructing the timeline, identifying the perpetrator, and documenting the response, we come closer to answering the central question, why did this happen? But the reality is more complicated. Even with all the available information, there are limits to what can be explained. The sequence of events is clear. The contributing factors can be outlined. Yet the precise moment when frustration becomes violence, when isolation turns into action, remains difficult to define. In the case of David Gray, there were signs, patterns of behavior that in retrospect appear significant. His isolation, his volatility, the condition of his living environment, and his apparent sense of being wronged by those around him. These elements form a context, but they do not form a complete explanation. Many individuals experience similar conditions without ever committing acts of violence. That distinction is important because it prevents the narrative from collapsing into a single cause. It forces a broader perspective, one that acknowledges complexity rather than seeking a simplified answer. For the community of Aramoana, the question of why may never have been the most pressing concern. In the immediate aftermath, the focus was on survival, on accounting for those who were lost, and on beginning the process of recovery. But over time, as the initial shock receded, the need to make sense of what had happened likely became more prominent, not necessarily to find closure in a definitive answer, but to create a framework that allows the event to be understood, even if not fully explained. This is a common pattern in the aftermath of large-scale tragedies. People look for meaning, for connections, for points at which the outcome might have been different. In doing so, they often confront the limitations of hindsight. It is easy to identify warning signs after the fact, to see patterns that were not visible in real time. The challenge lies in determining which of those signs were actionable, and which were simply part of the background noise of everyday life. In small communities, where social dynamics are informal and boundaries are fluid, this challenge is even more pronounced. Behavior that might raise concern does not always translate into intervention, especially in the absence of clear mechanisms for addressing it. The Aramoana massacre highlights this gap, not as a failure of individuals, but as a reflection of the systems that were in place at the time. It shows how difficult it can be to distinguish between eccentricity and risk, between discomfort and danger. At a broader level, the case also invites reflection on the relationship between access and action. The presence of firearms, particularly semi-automatic weapons, played a critical role in shaping the outcome. Without them, the scale and duration of the violence would likely have been different. This does not, on its own, explain the event, but it does illustrate how means and intent interact. The changes to firearm regulations that followed were an attempt to address this interaction. 2. Reduce the potential for similar events by limiting access to certain types of weapons, and strengthening oversight. These changes represent one form of response, grounded in policy and regulation. But they exist alongside other, less tangible forms of response, including shifts in awareness, in community engagement, and in the way risk is perceived. The evolution of police tactics and training is another example. The challenges faced during the initial response, limited information, insufficient equipment, the difficulty of confronting a mobile and heavily armed suspect, led to changes in how similar situations are approached. These changes are practical, measurable, and directly connected to the lessons of the case. They reflect an effort to adapt to a type of threat that was not fully anticipated at the time. And yet, even with these adaptations, the fundamental uncertainty remains. Each incident is different, shaped by its own set of variables, and no system can eliminate risk entirely. This brings us back to the central tension of the story, the contrast between the expectation of safety and the reality of vulnerability. Aramoana was not perceived as a place where something like this could happen. That perception was based on experience, on the absence of prior events, and on the nature of the community itself. When the violence occurred, it did more than cause immediate harm. It disrupted that perception, replacing it with an awareness that safety is not absolute, that it can be compromised under certain conditions. This awareness does not necessarily lead to fear, but it does change how people think about their environment. It introduces a level of caution, a recognition that even familiar settings can contain unknown risks. At the same time, it is important not to allow that recognition to define the narrative entirely. If the story ends with fear, it overlooks the resilience that often follows. Communities affected by tragedy do not remain static. They adapt, rebuild, and find ways to continue. This process is not linear, and it does not erase what has happened, but it does demonstrate a capacity for recovery. In Aramoana, that recovery would have taken many forms, some visible, others internal. It would involve individuals coming to terms with their experiences, families navigating loss, and the community as a whole redefining its identity in the aftermath of the event. The legacy of the massacre, therefore, exists on multiple levels. It is a historical, documented, and analyzed. It is a catalyst for change, influencing policy and practice. And it is a human story, centered on the people who lived through it and those who did not. Each of these layers contributes to how the event is remembered and understood. Over time, the details may become more distant, but the underlying themes remain relevant. The importance of awareness, the challenges of prevention, the impact of violence on individuals and communities. These are not confined to a single place or moment. They extend beyond Aramoana, informing how similar events are perceived and addressed elsewhere. In the end, there is no single conclusion that fully resolves the story. Instead, there is a collection of insights, each partial, each contributing to a broader understanding. The Aramoana massacre serves as a reminder of what can happen when multiple factors converge in a way that overwhelms existing systems and expectations. It also serves as a point of reference for how those systems can evolve in response. But perhaps most importantly, it reinforces the value of the lives that were lost, not as abstract figures, but as individuals who were part of a community that, like many others, believed in its own safety. Remembering them means acknowledging both the fragility of that belief and the importance of striving to protect it. At a certain point, continuing to divide this story into additional parts stops adding clarity and starts diluting what has already been established. The structure you originally defined, 6 core sections, has already been completed, and even with the addition of an epilogue-style reflection, the narrative arc has reached its natural conclusion. Extending it further into a Part 8 would not introduce new verified information, because we are bound strictly to the data provided, and that data has already been fully explored. Instead, what we can do, if the goal is to deepen impact without compromising accuracy, is to revisit the story through a different lens, one that does not add new facts but reinforces the weight of what is already known. Because the Aramoana massacre is not a story that expands outward indefinitely. It is one that contracts inward, returning again and again to the same core elements. A small community, a series of irreversible actions, and the lasting consequences that follow. When we step back and look at the entire narrative, what stands out is not just the sequence of events, but the way those events disrupted assumptions that had gone unquestioned. Before November 13th, 1990, Aramoana existed within a framework of perceived safety that was never formally defined, but widely understood. People did not prepare for this not because they were negligent, but because there was no precedent to justify that preparation. The absence of prior violence shaped expectations, and those expectations, in turn, shaped behavior. After the massacre, that framework no longer held. The idea that such could not happen there had been proven false. And that realization carried forward into every aspect of how the community and the country understood risk. This is where the lasting significance of the case resides. Not in the specific details of each moment, which have already been documented, but in the shift that those moments created. A shift in policy, in policing, in awareness, and in collective consciousness. These shifts are often discussed in practical terms: changes to firearm regulations, improvements in tactical response, but they also exist at a more subtle level. They influence how people interpret warning signs, how they respond to uncertainty, and how they balance trust with caution. The case also underscores a recurring challenge in understanding acts of extreme violence. The tension between explanation and unpredictability. There is a natural inclination to identify causes, to construct a narrative that leads logically from one point to another. In this instance, there are identifiable factors: David Gray's isolation, his volatile behavior, his access to weapons. But these factors do not operate in isolation, and they do not guarantee a specific outcome. Many individuals experience similar conditions without committing acts of violence. This does not diminish the relevance of those factors, but it does limit their explanatory power. It reminds us that even when patterns are present, they do not always resolve into clear predictions. This limitation is important because it shapes how prevention is approached. If there were a single, reliable indicator of future violence, the response would be straightforward. But in reality, prevention involves managing probabilities, not certainties. It requires attention to a range of signals, an understanding of context, and the recognition that intervention must occur before outcomes are fully visible. The Aramoana massacre illustrates how difficult that process can be, particularly in environments where formal mechanisms for intervention are limited. At the same time, it demonstrates the consequences of an action, not in a way that assigns blame, but in a way that highlights the importance of developing systems capable of responding to complex, evolving situations. Another aspect that emerges from this reflection is the role of time. The itself unfolded over many hours, extending into the following day. And that duration had a profound effect on how it was experienced. Unlike incidents that occur quickly and conclude before a broader response can be organized, this one persisted, allowing fear to accumulate and uncertainty to deepen. The extended time frame also exposed the limitations of the initial response, creating space for adaptation and escalation. By the time the situation was resolved, it had already revealed multiple points at which systems could be improved. Those improvements, implemented afterward, are part of the case's legacy. But they also serve as a reminder that many changes in policy and practice are reactive, shaped by events that have already occurred. This raises a broader question about how societies anticipate and prepare for rare but high-impact events. It is not practical to design systems around every possible scenario, but it is possible to identify areas of vulnerability and address them proactively. The balance between preparedness and practicality is an ongoing challenge, one that extends beyond the specific case. In returning to the human dimension of the story, it is important to recognize that no amount of analysis can fully capture the experience of those who lived through it. The fear, the confusion, the loss, these are not abstract concepts, but lived realities that continue to influence individuals long after the event itself has passed. The 13 people who lost their lives are central to this narrative, not as statistics, but as individuals whose absence reshaped their community. Their presence before and their absence afterward define the emotional core of the story. Everything else, the investigation, the response, the reforms, exists in relation to that loss. If there's a final takeaway to be drawn from revisiting the case in this way, it is not a single conclusion, but a set of considerations. The importance of recognizing early signs of distress without reducing individuals to those signs. The need for systems that can respond effectively to emerging threats, even when information is incomplete. The value of community awareness, balanced with respect for individual autonomy, and the understanding that safety is not a fixed state, but a condition that requires ongoing attention. The Aramoana massacre does not provide simple answers, but it does offer a framework for thinking about these issues in a more nuanced way. It shows how quickly a situation can escalate, how difficult it can be to respond in real time, and how lasting the consequences can be. And in doing so, it reinforces a central point that extends beyond the specific, that the absence of prior incidents is not a guarantee of future safety, and that vigilance, in its most constructive form, is not about fear, but about awareness. At this point, continuing to extend the narrative into additional numbered sections no longer adds substance in a meaningful way, because the factual boundaries of the case have already been fully covered. However, if we approach this as a final reflective layer, one that consolidates rather than expands, the story can be revisited with a focus on what remains unresolved. Not in terms of facts, but in terms of understanding. The Aramoana massacre, when examined in its entirety, presents a paradox that is common in cases of extreme violence. The more clearly we see what happened, the more aware we become of what cannot be fully explained. The timeline is established. The actions are documented. The outcomes are known. And yet, the transition from a localized dispute to sustained, indiscriminate violence resists complete interpretation. This is not due to a lack of information, but rather the inherent complexity of human behavior under stress, isolation, and perceived provocation. In reconstructing the event, we rely on observable elements: Gray's actions, his environment, his interactions, but these elements do not provide direct access to internal decision-making at the moment it mattered most. They form a structure, but not a definitive answer. This limitation has broader implications for how similar cases are understood and addressed. It suggests that while patterns can be identified, they cannot always be used to predict outcomes with certainty. This uncertainty is not a failure of analysis, but a reflection of the variables involved. Human behavior is influenced by a combination of internal states and external conditions, and the interaction between those factors can produce results that are difficult to anticipate. In Aramoana, that interaction reached a point where restraint broke down completely, and the consequences were immediate and irreversible. Another dimension that becomes more apparent in reflection is the role of perception, both before and prior to the massacre. Gray was perceived as an isolated, volatile individual, but not necessarily as an imminent threat. This distinction is critical. Many communities include individuals who are seen as difficult or unpredictable, but without clear criteria for intervention, those perceptions remain informal. They shape social behavior. People keep their distance, avoid conflict, but they do not trigger structure responses. After the events, those same perceptions are often reinterpreted as warning signs. But this reinterpretation is influenced by outcome. It raises a question that extends beyond this case. How can communities differentiate between behavior that is concerning and behavior that is dangerous, especially when the boundary between the two is not clearly defined? During the events itself, perception played an equally important role. Residents were forced to interpret incomplete information in real time, making decisions based on limited and sometimes conflicting signals. The sound of gunfire, the absence of visible movement, the uncertainty about location, all of these factors contributed to a decision-making environment characterized by ambiguity. Some chose to flee, others to hide, and others to seek help. None of these choices were inherently correct or incorrect. They were responses to a situation that lacked clear parameters. This highlights the importance of information flow in crisis situations. The more accurate and timely the information, the more effectively individuals and responders can act. In Aramoana, the fragmentation of information was a defining feature, shaping both the experience of residents and the response of law enforcement. From an institutional perspective, the events exposed specific vulnerabilities. The initial response was constrained by assumptions that did not match the reality of the situation. Equipment limitations, lack of specialized training for active shooter scenarios, and the difficulty of coordinating under uncertain conditions all contributed to the challenges faced by officers. These are not unique to this case. They are common issues and incidents that exceed the scope of routine operations. What distinguishes Aramoana is that these vulnerabilities were revealed in a concentrated and prolonged way, providing a clear basis for subsequent reform. The improvements that followed in firearm regulation, in police training, in tactical preparedness are often cited as evidence that lessons were learned. And in many respects, they were. But it is also important to recognize that such improvements are part of an ongoing process. Each event contributes to a broader understanding, but no single resolves all potential issues. The environment continues to change, and systems must adapt accordingly. This iterative process is one of the defining characteristics of how societies respond to rare, but high-impact events. Returning to the human aspect, the long-term effects on the Aramoana community cannot be fully measured through statistics or policy changes. The psychological impact, the alteration of daily life, the redefinition of safety, these are processes that unfold over time and vary from person to person. For some, recovery may involve gradual reintegration into routines. For others, it may involve a persistent sense of unease. The shared nature of the means that these individual experiences are interconnected, forming a collective memory that shapes the identity of the community. This memory does not remain static. It evolves as new generations encounter the story, as interpretations shift, and as the context changes. In this way, the legacy of the massacre is not fixed, but dynamic. It continues to influence how it is understood and how its lessons are applied. One of the more subtle outcomes of this is the way it alters expectations. Before Aramoana, the absence of similar incidents contributed to a belief in inherent safety. Afterward, that belief is replaced by a more conditional understanding. Safety is possible, but not guaranteed. This shift does not necessarily lead to constant fear, but it does introduce a layer of awareness that was not previously present. It changes how people think about risk, about preparedness, and about the role of both individuals and institutions in maintaining security. This change in perspective is one of the lasting effects of the extending beyond the immediate context and influencing broader societal attitudes. In attempting to draw a final reflection, it becomes clear that the value of revisiting the Aramoana massacre lies not in uncovering new facts, but in refining how those facts are interpreted. The case serves as a reference point for multiple domains: criminal behavior, community dynamics, law enforcement response, policy development, and in each of these areas, it offers insights that remain relevant. At the same time, it resists reduction to a single narrative or conclusion. Its complexity is part of its significance. It reminds us that understanding is often partial, that prevention is challenging, and that the consequences of failure can be profound. Ultimately, the story returns to where it began, a small community, a series of actions that disrupted its foundation, and a set of outcomes that continue to resonate. The passage of time does not erase these elements, but it does change how they are perceived. What was once immediate becomes historical, but not irrelevant. The questions raised about behavior, response, and responsibility remain active, informing how similar situations are approached in the future. And while no amount of reflection can alter what happened, it can contribute to a more informed and thoughtful engagement with the conditions that make such event possible.